Welcome everyone to EC Contemporary. Thank you so much for spending your Monday evening here with us. So we're here for the artist talk by Marcos Kueh, who has his first institutional solo exhibition here with us, Smooth Sailing, 一路顺风. And today's artist talk is titled Love, Labor, and Cultural Repair. And it takes, the title is taken from a title of one of the artworks in the Smooth Sailing suite, called Love, Labor, Loneliness, which is the kinetic sculpture of an embroidery machine that you see in the gallery. And before I continue further, a couple of housekeeping announcements. So there will be photography going on. If you prefer not to be photographed, please let my colleagues know. We've got a yellow name tag. Although I can probably safely say most of the time will be the back of your face, as the star is Marcus. And there's also a video recording, but I think it's also the camera's aiming this way. And the fire exits are the main exit over there. And toilets are downstairs, and we also have a lift if you prefer to take a lift rather than the stairs. And yeah, I'm going to sit down and carry on with this. And so you were seated here amidst the exhibition that is Smooth Sailing, 一路顺风. It begins here in our communal project space with this installation titled Three Contemporary Prosperities. And it's a kind of contemporary take on three Chinese deities that you can commonly find in many Chinese homes. And they represent, so they're 福禄寿, 福禄寿, and they represent prosperity, kind of luck, reputation, and longevity. And here he imagines what this kind of values or wishes of what this counts as a good life could be in 2025. And every time this work is shown, it is updated to kind of like the next level of aspiration or achievement. And so the millionaire in 2023 is now a billionaire in 2025. And the influencer is now the perfect celebrity, a la Kim Kardashian's success trajectory. Yeah. And we've also managed to show this in two phases. So we opened the show on the 24th of October with the 2023 suite of works, and then now you see the 2025 set with us. And of course, the star of the show is the new commission in the gallery. And so that's the whole body of work is called Smooth Sailing. And in fact, this exhibition here today is a partner exhibition of the Asia Triennial 6, which will be opening tomorrow. And before I go further into introducing the works in the gallery, we've talked about the works here and now the people here as well. So joining Marcos Kueh on this conversation is Amy George, Senior Curator of Collections, Textiles and Wallpaper at the Whitworth, as well as Dr. Vera Mey, Asia Triennial Manchester 6 Curatorial Research Fellow at the Manchester School of Art. And so in making this new body of work that is Smooth Sailing, it started with a 1-month residency, which was the first trip for you in Manchester. So I thought we would begin today's conversation with Marcus talking about the research process and the developments after that. During this research process, he also accessed the Whitworth's internationally renowned textiles collections, where Amy very helpfully guided him through, and I also got a sneak peek into the collection. And then, of course, we'll later move on to discussing the works in conversation with Vera and Amy. And of course, this kind of research process and the residency, as well as this exhibition, this kind of scale and level of sort of commitment and engagement is only possible with the support of individuals as well as organizations and institutions, which I will now name, which is, of course, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, Arts Council England, the Mondrian Funds, the Dutch Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in the UK here, and of course the co-commissioner of the new works that you see in the gallery, Manchester Metropolitan University, that's organizing the Asia Triennial Manchester, as well as Center for Heritage, Art and Textile in Hong Kong, where the work, or some of the works, will be traveling to next year. So now I think I can pass it on to you to start about this first trip that you had in Manchester, and now you had so many trips here.
Yeah. Where do I even begin? Probably from the residency.
Yeah.
Well, my name is Marcos. I grew up in Malaysia, but currently I'm based in the Netherlands, working as a textile artist. My background is in graphic design, advertising, and then later on I moved into textile design. Worked in an industrial factory for a bit, and then turned into an artist. Previously, a lot of my works are talking about my exotic identity coming from Borneo. And I've been working in Europe for 4 years. And somehow during that 4 years, I've slowly kind of like reconsidered my identity as well. Before this, I was really, because I grew up in Borneo, a lot of the conversation was about that. But this year in particular, I was slowly moving into my ponderings and my ponderings on what it means to be a Chinese passing non-European working in the textile factories. It was also coincidentally when I got invited by Jo-Lene to come to do a research residency in Manchester. And sometimes in life, things just happen on its own. Manchester, of course, everyone knows that it's the start of the place where the industrial revolution started. And I wanted to come to the city to kind of dive into what that meant. What it meant for humans to suddenly produce this much. What it meant for workers to suddenly get thrown into situations that we are not familiar with as well, like factory work.
And also the migration from like farmland, rural, to these industrial centers like Manchester City, and also because the industrial revolution here was so rooted on the textile industry. Cottonopolis was the name of Manchester at some point.
Yeah, I think as an artist, sometimes it's selfish need to also try to understand what is going on in my life, where I am in my life, through understanding the world as well. I thought like coming to Manchester would give me like a hint of like how I can, understand and describe what it means to be in this part of my life. And from that 1 month residency in summer, this came out.
Maybe a bit about Amy, when Marcus twice, right?
So you came, 2 times to the Whitworth Study Centre. So for those of you who aren't familiar, the Whitworth Art Gallery, which is kind of down the Oxford Road at the bottom end of the University of Manchester, has a textile collection of about 25,000 objects which span 2,000 years and are from lots of different countries from all over the world. So when you first got in touch and said you were interested in coming to see the collection, there was quite a wide range of different things that you wanted to see, and actually, eventually what we got talking about was the kind of idea and the concept behind the collection itself. So the Whitworth was founded in 1889, and at that point, about 80% of the world's cotton was being exported from the northwest of Manchester. It was like many different museums, like regional museums, in different industrial centres. It was founded to inspire the manufacturers of the region. So it was never a collection of Manchester textiles. It was a collection that brought together global textiles to kind of to inspire, basically. And so what we ended up looking at were fragments, weren't they? There were fragments of cloth that were brought in from different parts of the world, mainly through a series called the Forbes Watson Pattern Books, or the Textile Manufacturers of India. So they were a series, kind of over 2 volumes really, which the British government commissioned, which were really collecting textiles from across South Asia in these beautiful volumes, and where you could kind of see different weave, embroidery and printing techniques. And also 4 boxes of textiles from Japan as well, these little kind of swatches. And I thought that was really interesting that we were looking at fragments, and we were looking really deeply at those kind of techniques. And we were talking about these processes of craft, so we're talking about exchange and extraction and about appropriation, but we were also talking about how industrial processes replace the hand, and then we were also talking about kind of digital. So I thought that was, because what came out of it was actually your craft and how much your process, like how much you kind of knew about weave, really. That was, I kind of fangirls on, so, how the weave structure, how basically how really, really difficult it is to do what you do, and basically creating artwork on cloth, off print, embroidery, weave is the most kind of technically difficult. So that was
I remember a lot of our conversations. Because the first question I asked you was really like, why is the collection all just in fragments? Because maybe somehow in my perception of like archival objects, it's always like in full artwork. Before I kind of go to the collection, and it's like all these fragments and
these trays and trays and trays.
Yeah.
Those are the boxes,
those are the boxes. And then when you told me that actually these are not meant to be like an art collection, but actually are donations from like the industry, it kind of clicked in my head that it's so fascinating to think about how in contemporary times when we talk about art collections, we talk about artworks that were donated because they were art, but back then these are all kind of like remnants of like an industry that has ended up in a collection. And there's still gaps in like how we kind of describe objects like this in like museums that I find very, very interesting. Of course, for me, in that conversation, it also opened up this whole train of thought as well of what it means to have a culture being seen that way, right? You have textiles that are made in China, Japan, in the East, with their own symbols and their own meanings, but then it traveled over to Manchester with the purpose of being copied and commercialized and commodified. But then when that ended, it kind of like got into this museum, and then in the museum context, we haven't properly defined how we describe this object. I think that is also parallel to a lot of the things I'm thinking about when it comes down to migrated labor as well, of why we travel, and when we travel, what is the purpose and what is our worth traveling to a new country, and how our labor is being seen or used. I think those are like interesting parallels that kind of helped me kind of develop the narrative in this exhibition.
Quite interesting because it's the people, isn't it? So like when you get something that's this big or this big, where is that? It might have been worn, or it might have been draped, or it might have been a home even, but it's completely removed from that. So it's about you're kind of reinserting a human within that kind of engagement, I suppose.
I think seeing an object as well, it's also, there's a lot of imagination of what the intention is. We of course don't know specifically what is it about, but that's also where the imagination comes in when we're doing research, or when we're imagining art as well. Like, how do we describe the intention of how all these objects ended up in spaces? Something that I'm always really interested in. It's like you're looking at a piece of object and then you're imagining the life behind it. And that's really fun. That was really fun,
I think that's why I kind of preluded the conversation by explaining these works here, which are usually fulusho. Normally they're on a mini altar, and with your kind of take on this piece here, it begins this questioning process of like the shifting value or the shifting identity of objects from something industrial to museological to and whatnot, and also when people travel and people move, like what it means when we move from a place like, I think the three of us have Southeast Asian roots, and we've moved to Europe. So the positionality and identity also shifts. Your kind of relation to different coordinates also shift, and I think this kind of sets the tone. Almost like a fore altar where we come and we also reflect on our own kind of shifting positions and values before we enter the gallery space. And of course, once we enter the gallery space, the thing, well, before you even enter the gallery space, there is a work. You're greeted by spirit of labor, which also has a function. So normally tapestries are hung and you don't touch them. But the spirit of labor, you're meant to open it like a curtain. I think a visitor who was also at the Textile Biennial where you were speaking made a very good observation that it's actually beautiful that you get to touch this, and by the end of the 3 months of the exhibition, it bears the wear and tear of our hands quite similarly like how these labor union banners and certificates, which is where it was taken its inspiration from, would have also bared the people's, their sweat and their palms as they were carrying it through our protests to get their rights. And maybe we can start from there with either you or Vera, a bit of observations on spirit of labor.
Sure, I'm very curious about your experience working in this factory and how that might have, with your training in graphic design, but also reshaped the ways that you kind of conceptualized.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting topic as well. I'm going to try to connect it with like the labor union certificates from the People's History Museum. I feel like when I'm looking at the labor union certificates, it just feels a bit closer to heart. Because when you work in a factory, you're not an artist, right? You're producing for someone else, and you're almost most of the time invisible, and you're always so obsessed with like trying to develop things that might not even bear your name. At the end of the day, when you are like doing a development for textiles, it will bear the name of Nike, it will bear the name of a certain like artist's big name. But like as a developer, sometimes you might see your name, you credit someone like down the road, but it's a different kind of like positioning when you want to do that type of work, right? You're like trying to contribute to like a different kind of like sense of placement in the world when you're doing this artwork. So when I'm looking at the labor unions, I gravitate towards it because you also understand how invisible it can be working in such a big industry. I imagine back then when you're working in a factory, it could be like thousands and thousands of people doing certain things, and who's going to see you, who's going to protect you. And when you have these labor certificates that is talking about like, hey, if let's say you die, we're going to take care of your wife, or if you're sick, if someone's going to pay you, it means a lot, right? And that was the first contact where I felt some sort of connection with this value system that was birthed and like, conceived in a time where it's very hard to imagine, because right now when you go to like factories, even in the Science and Technology Museum, they have cleaned out the factory, they have made it accessible for wheelchairs, but back then it was all like dirty, people get into like a lot of dangerous situations, it's messy, it's loud. And there's something very honest about, and also kind of like humanistic about being seen like that, if it makes sense. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that you're talking about these kind of unions and labour certificates, because I think, hearing what you were saying about how most of the textile industry is concentrated here, obviously now it's completely outsourced to Southeast Asia, and the kind of ability to have unions and workers' rights in that region is completely eroded. So I'm wondering if there was a kind of odd sort of displacement or reversal of, this kind of dynamic when you moved to Europe and kind of started producing these textiles, kind of, like another kind of circular movement away from the space of production and proximity to this, more distant and somewhat sort of conceptual, like I really liked your quote that I think it's like the textile is the work of the mind, not of the hand anymore. And the kind of automation and machinery that is so very visible in the exhibition itself. What was your kind of motivation for like making that machine process very visible?
I had the same kind of like conversation because I was in a textile biennale just a few days ago, but that was really more craft based. But I always thought like, for us to have a conversation about the industry in contemporary times, I think it's important to be able to do it from a language that is actually producing our textiles, if it makes sense. It is very easy to have this narrative of like going back to like our moral values by using our hands, but the reality is that in the industry and how we kind of like interact with textiles nowadays is actually through the mass production of industrial machines. But I'm always wondering as well, like, just because it's industrially produced and it's mass produced, does it mean that there's no way for us to kind of like inject a bit of like sentiment of human values into how we produce things? Perhaps it's not just about changing like the process of how we do things, but it is about changing how we emotionally deal with the process, if it makes sense. You know, like if we could imagine industrial production of textiles not as this heavy, sterile mass production for money. If we kind of kind of like consider humanistic values when we kind of produce things, would we make different decisions when we produce things? And I think that there is still a lot of kind of like conversations that can happen in this field. But I feel like a lot of the focus is on, if you're doing hands work, then it's like, oh, that's great, you know, like we're going back to some sort of tradition. But that is a bit of like a privileged distance that you can have, right? I come from Southeast Asia, and if you are in a day-to-day work, you can't sustain yourself through craft, and you can't have that conversation. Whereas when you are in the UK, where you kind of walk past already, you can go past that industrial past, conversations like this sound very easy, if it makes sense.
I think that's exactly what you were saying, that what was an industrial, or what is an industrial past, has just shifted to places like Malaysia, Bangladesh, or Cambodia, that's producing a lot of the fast fashion. And I think one of the conversations we had when we first arrived, before this whole kind of concept came into place, was your observation from another residency, the one in Prato. And I don't know, you want to speak a bit about that?
Yeah, it's a story kind of that I heard because I was doing a small technical residency in Prato.
In Italy?
Yeah, in Italy. And Prato is the textile district of Italy that produces the luxury goods for Paris. So the story goes that in Paris there's like this luxury brand that shifted their production to a Chinese producer. So people were complaining about, you know, why are you shifting the Chinese to China? It's very, you know, it's a very understandable, relatable story. But everyone says the same thing. So being Chinese, what it did logically was to move the whole factory from China into Italy. So Prato is practically more than half Chinese.
Yeah.
And they have their own Chinese communities there, they have their own factories there. They don't integrate into the Italian culture because they think that, you know, they want to kind of uphold that like Chinese culture integrity. And every time I talk about this story, the first thing that pops up on people's heads and on most people's heads, the first thing they tell me is like, yeah, Marcos, don't you think that the Chinese factory workers are a bit more abusive to their workers? And that's kind of like up something in my head, like, okay, but then how do you have this conversation? Why do you automatically assume that as number one? And how do you have this conversation when you have Western companies like Nike building factories in Cambodia, working the Cambodians with like, you know, analytical kind of like processes as well? Like, how do you kind of weigh these two conversations? So like in this small conversation, you can already kind of see how in the process of talking about textile production, there is an element of like how we can talk about capitalism and it stretches into the giant web. There's an element as well of talking about class and race, because there is already a perception, right? If a bag is made in Italy, there is something about that. But then of course it goes to a different layer. It's made in Italy, but is it made by Italian Italy or is it Chinese Italy? Then it goes in more and more and more. And I feel like in the capitalistic world, we kind of like hold on to the integrity of the product through like the myth, how this product has been produced, and I find that also very interesting. Like how do you describe that? It's something that it's complicated, and I'm trying to fledge it out slowly in my practice. Yeah.
And I think you have also fledge it out by exploring different forms and materials. So, like, I think prior to this, mostly your works are these woven tapestries that you would display mostly in sort of a hanging format. Of course, you also hang in sort of a installation form at times. But I think it is in the gallery here that you've really started to explore more sculptural forms and installation with the giant sail and mast that's run around, as well as this kinetic sculpture or industrial found object as a kinetic sculpture, and also the new medium that is embroidery, the piece that you see on the wall. Maybe you can walk us through a little bit to maybe the big sail, I would imagine, this huge centerpiece of the show.
Well, I mean, as a textile artist, what I'm also trying to explore besides development of like textiles, like the complicated development of textiles, is also how we experience textiles. I'm trying to see like if a textile is big and like you need to see like this, what does that mean? If you have to touch textiles and open it like this, how would the textile experience be? Because in a weird way, it's also like this defiance towards like how we experience art as well, right? You have like a painting on the wall, and all you can do when you're in art space is like stare at this painting with your hands behind your back. And I mean, as a textile person, being, like textile, like how do we kind of challenge that? So in one of my works, for example, the Earth project, for example, it's about going into the textiles and experiencing and being enveloped by textiles. Because in Borneo, we also have this saying that when you're born, the first thing that you interact with and you're wrapped by is textiles. And when you die, the last thing that you get sent off into the under your afterlife is also textiles. So how do you kind of like translate that experience of textiles into the world is something that I'm always challenging myself to do. And that's also very specifically textiles. It's like not something that sculpture, like a ceramic sculpture can induce or like a painting can do. So what you can also see in the show is like, what if we dream? What if there's a scale? What if we open things up, if we touch? And we try to see how we can do as much experience and like how we can use the textile to tell as much of a different experience as possible. Yeah, if it makes sense. Yeah.
I'm interested in, industrial processes in some ways. So if you wanted to set up a jacquard loom, you're probably going to set it up and have hundreds and hundreds of meters of fabric coming off it. And similarly, if you wanted a printed cloth, if you're going to make a roller, then really you need just the same design coming through again and again. Digital, that's in some ways freed up. So in some way, you're talking about the kind of mix between hand and machine. Actually, in order to create a bespoke object, you've got that freedom again with digital weaving. That's right.
Yeah.
But it's a hugely complicated process to be able to kind of settle that up, and what you're managing to do is to create depth and texture and using those different yarns. I just wonder if you could say a bit more about that, because I wonder if you don't just drop a JPEG in and that comes out, do you? So how you kind of go about that, and how you, or your different roles within that.
Maybe a mini introduction
Yeah.
to the jacquard
Yeah.
loom, like how you were telling me, because I was a complete beginner. Like it's 8 yarns and how they're different weaves to create different effects and like the color and light. Basics. Because sometimes when visitors come in and then I tell them that yes, they were kind of digitally produced and it's an industrial loom, and they're like, oh yeah, so he just made the design and put the file in. I'm like, well, not really. You don't just press print.
Yeah. It's always interesting being in the intersection of like art, design, and craft. Being in this textile industry, because you have moments where you talk about the more conceptual research things, but you have moments where you have to talk about like the geeky stuff of the technical things. And when I'm invited for like the textile museum, for example, then we go into the geeky stuff, and that's where I feel more confident because I don't bore people to that. But the basic idea is that the way that I would describe my work is that if you have a cat, let's use the ocean. Ocean is a bit better. If you image of an ocean, you send it to the factory, someone needs to translate the ocean into a machine-readable file so that the machine can kind of like weave. So my job, besides of course translating the file to like an ocean, is always questioning why do we want to translate this file into an ocean and how we can make it more ocean-like. So does that mean that in our bindings we can make it more loose so that the yarns float more and then you get some sort of like wave effect? Can we use some sort of reflective yarn or shiny yarn so that you get like the glittering wet effect of the ocean? So those are things that I consider when I'm weaving. And of course what you're seeing here, for example, it might look like a 3-color piece, but actually it's all made with a repeat of 8 yarns. And when I say yarns, I don't use colors because you can have 2 reds, but one can be a fluffy red or like a matte red, and that's already 2 yarns. So this one has a few tones of red, a gold, a pink, and 2 tones of blue, and that's how you kind of create a lot of that. My job is, as a fabric producer, is just to arrange the yarns so that the yarns can kind of form this type of colors, like a range of colors. And depending on what 8 sets of colors you choose, it changes the colors drastically. So this is 8 yarns, the whole way is 8 yarns, the big cell is all 8 yarns. If you look at the whole way piece, from afar it's colorful, but when you look into the detail, if you have the chance, you will also notice that they are all formed by patterns. And those are the patterns where I'm also programmed, where I'm also researching or programming, because the patterns are formed by 2 colors, and that gives the dimension of like color mixing. So the theory of weaving is a bit different from the theory of color mixing and painting. It's the illusion of like putting 2 yarns together. So if you have a red yarn and a blue yarn, and you kind of bind it, from afar it looks purple, but when you look in, it's actually formed by 2 pure colors. If it makes sense. And that's how you kind of get dimension. So depending on how much red you show and how much blue you show, that's how much purple you get. That's the dimension, kind of. But then in the weaving world, then you also think about what if the red is like a fluffy red? What type of colors will you produce? What if the blue is a shiny blue? What type of colors do you produce? And that is the complicated part of like, well, it's not complicated, it's the exciting part of what this job is about. It's like really about developing this like very intense color palettes. As a weaver, I also work with different machines. So I work with different factories. When I go down to a factory, the first thing I do is to understand the machine. The works that you see in this show is produced in EU exclusives, and they're one of the last factories left in the Netherlands. And originally there were fabric label weavers. So the
Labels of your clothes.
yeah, so labels for your clothes. So their weave setup is very, very tight, and that's how you can get like very, very fine details on the work. There is 11,520 yarns for the warp of this work, and my job as a textile programmer is to command on this warp on how they march. There's only 2 commands. Either you raise the yarns or you put it down. So it's like 1 and 0. So it's a bit like computer graphics as well. Kind of like, that's like the explanation.
Mind blowing. I'm sure there's more.
Thank you for
Yeah.
But maybe this is a good moment to segue into how that process differs from embroidery, which is a new kind of method for you. And dare I say, I'm a little bit of an expert myself now that I've had to manage the kinetic sculpture that operates throughout the exhibition run. Yeah.
Well, with the embroidery machine, it started from this desire to introduce industrial machines into the art space. You know, when I'm talking about a lot of my stories, it's a lot of like imagination with drawings, imagination with visuals. But how do you describe something so brutal with just illustrations? So in my head, I wanted to have like a very straightforward object, found object of an industrial machine placed inside the art space to introduce, you know, like the reality of what produces our clothes. And I've been telling people this thing where it's like this city kid with a chicken syndrome, where the city kid would always know what an egg is and the image of what a chicken is, but they will never understand what a chicken is because they've never seen a chicken. So we all know textiles, we all know industrially created, fabricated textiles, pants, this chair, it's all woven, but we have never seen what an industrial machine looks like that produces our work and how fast it's actually producing and what sound it makes. And for me, because we don't see the machines, that means that we also don't see the humans who are producing all the things that keeps us running every single day. That, you know, like sometimes we forget that for us to function day to day, there's so many people that's trying their best to make sure that we can not freeze to death in the winter.
Buy an orange in the supermarket, right? And the shelves are always stuffed. Like that logistic process is pretty mad.
Yeah, so I wanted to see how we can bring in industrial machines into our space and start that conversation to get the audience closer to, like, you know, the process of fabric being made in real life, and see it conceptually of what it means when it's not in a factory and it's in an art space. The word that I'm currently using is working class technology. In the art space, we are very used to talking about AI, the future, flying to Mars, robotics, but we are not used to talking about working class technology, of the technology that is already here keeping us going. Because we still have this hierarchy of thinking, of course, you know, like the next frontier is more exciting.
Yeah.
What is keeping us alive is like, they should just work.
Maybe I could ask Vera to share some of your thoughts, because I think what he's talking about with like the working class technology and just hierarchies that prevent us from truly appreciating or learning about it also relates to something that you did when you were artistic director of the Busan Biennial recently, about shifting or looking at alternatives to knowledges that came out of the Western Enlightenment. So I wondered what you were thinking, what you felt when you saw that machine kind of like doing its thing, you know, and it's titled Love, Labor, Loneliness.
Yeah, I mean, fascinatingly, I think, you know, some of the iconographies you were using and some of the terminologies you were using, I think, for example, in a Southeast Asian context, things like even referencing workers' rights, which allude to histories of communism, are still really, you know, there's still a lot of tension.
Taboo.
It's quite taboo, so it's kind of interesting, and I think, you know, really celebratory that you are kind of centering, labour and work in a way that is quite refreshing for a Southeast Asian artist to kind of show that. So it's kind of such an opulent and, you know, elaborate manner. Like, I mean, even the term working class, I think, in a Southeast Asian context is like not necessarily seen as like a celebrated.
Or reclaiming.
Exactly.
Which, it's. I mean, I'll give you a very concrete example. When I was a Curatorial Research Fellow at the Apple in Amsterdam, I had to work part-time waiting tables. I think my mom would freak out if she knew I moved all the way to Amsterdam to wait tables. Like, you know, but no one freaks out if you do that in the Netherlands. You're like, yeah, right, you do various jobs. That's how the world moves. Yeah. But if you go to Malaysia and you tell your parents like, oh yeah, I work at the coffee shop that's serving coffee, you'd be like, what have you done? How have I failed? And I think, this is an interesting shift with the kind of younger generation in Southeast Asia.
Or like migration, particularly of quite an educated class of Southeast Asians. You know, we often talk about class mobility upward, but not necessarily downward. Particularly when you know, move to the global north, right? But I was interested, for example, in the way that you also reference, you know, not only the site of production through the machine, but also the ways that value, particularly with textiles and such an elaborate technology, is really intervened with quite physically and intensely through this process of burning textiles. I thought maybe it would be quite interesting for people to hear about how on the back wall you have a series of embroideries, I believe, that are intentionally burned, and Jo-Lene was telling me that it's from surplus textiles, and if you could share a bit more about the references in that.
Yeah, well, it's supposed to act like a shadow of the work. Yeah, this is a question that I actually actually saw it in 2023 in Singapore. I was passing by a building, and I saw this supposedly, I don't know how you call this in English. It's like a Chinese
Talisman.
talisman. Yeah, where it says like wishing you good business, but then it's like slowly disintegrated, and it's like the wall randomly or something like that. People just forgot and it's just weathered, and I just thought like, oh, thank you, you know, like for wishing you good business before you kind of disintegrate completely. And I thought like there was such an interesting thing, like, you know, before something that you will understand, like it's more that you understand, disappears completely. You still got a last glimpse of what it kind of is, even though it's like tattered. So I kind of wanted to kind of mimic that in that work. So when you look into like the details of the embroidery work, it is all this well-wishing from vintage Chinese businesses, because back then when Chinese people create logos for the businesses, that they tend to also put in well-wishings. But nowadays we don't do
Almost
it
like an
anymore.
animist, like, you know, like,
Big happiness, big
yeah,
fortune.
Yeah.
it's kind of like drawing it towards you or something.
Yeah. And nowadays it's too tacky, like, you know, you have to be like edgy, you have to be like, but like we know the next what we're gonna. The language that we use is has already shifted. And in between those are also like temple talismans and also like Chinese well-wishing, and it's slowly kind of like burned away. 25% of the textiles that we produce in this world gets incinerated in the end. And it's also this question like, okay, if at the end of the day we're trying so hard to produce and abuse workers and like destroy economies, like, and at the end of the day it's just gonna disappear anyways. Like,
But it's an intentional incineration, right?
yeah, because we produce way too much and we can't sustain having so much textiles. So 25% is a quarter, which is a lot of textiles. And of course we don't see it here. It's normally incinerated in Indonesia or Africa. Then what does this all mean? What does all this suffering mean for us to be trapped in this place? And I feel like that is also the kind of conversation I'm trying to also talk about in like how we produce textiles and how we run our businesses in textiles. You know, is there a meaning to all these chains of like fortune? Yeah. So that was kind of how I kind of ended the show over here. Yeah.
And there's also this quite interesting contrast, I think, of this band, which is kind of references workers of the world unite, but then very kind of like animist, sort of aspirational, like that you have like a billionaire deity. I think it's like a really interesting contrast in like Chinese culture and in some respects.
Yeah, I think you're on the point of that, because it's just, I grew up with my parents always wanting me to be rich,
Yeah.
because that's what you want your next generation to be, and you always imagine growing up like, you know, you have to go out in the world, there's this glorious world out there for you to look for like some sort of like, yeah, place where you can finally rest in a lot of money or in like a lot of like success, but it's not always the case. When you go into the world, the whole way acts like this promise, a promise of a glorious labor, a promise of like, you know, safety in the end, like a happy ending. But the moment you enter the room, it's a shipwreck, because we always almost only hear about the success stories of people with names are the people who made it. And that's not always the case, right? Most of the time, people who travel out into the world, I'm somewhat the semi-lucky one, but most of my friends they're still cleaning dishes and stuff like that. And is this what they wanted when they kind of went up that ship to go to the Netherlands? Not necessarily. And that's kind of like what the story I'm trying to tell with this integrated labor as well, of circumstances, that's the word I use, circumstances.
I find that quite fascinating because you left, the island of Borneo, which is the third largest island in the world, actually, a place known for its kind of biodiversity and kind of untouchedness, for lack of a better word, even though it's kind of got a history of migration. In some ways, you left paradise.
Yeah, it's,
Arguably,
you know,
yeah.
it's a complicated kind of like conversation, because from the outside world it is paradise. But from the inside, you always want to be like, oh, I also want to have, I don't know, equal rights, workers' rights. I want to earn in euros. I want to afford things. And
If you know it's cold and there's bad food.
but when you're in the
But
island,
in the Netherlands, there is that food and cold, but the trains are working, public transport, healthcare that is actually in place.
or at least you have this idea that, like, you are. I was born knowing that I'm in a developing country. And that's something that I cannot change, right? When you're born into a developing country, it will always be the fact that I am never as developed as a Western world.
Always changing.
So the only idea of like progress for me is to go to a developed world because that's probably where I'll get the answer. And then you travel and travel and travel and you
Yeah. I think interestingly, what Vera brought up touched on your first or earlier body of research, the Triennial Circus. Maybe do you think you want to just briefly connect what you spoke about, like in terms of like Borneo being this viewed as an untouched paradise, and it's also seen or exoticized, not only by the West, but even by those in Peninsular Malaysia where I'm from. Maybe a bit of a background for the people here, your first body of work.
Yeah, so I graduated Triennial Circus and that's how I started my career. The basic idea is that I took all the stereotypical ideas of what it means to come from like an exotic land, create creatures out of them, wove them into giant posters with the intention of selling it to the West. It's like very straight up like this, and I'm the ringmaster that brings all these circus creatures around to sell. The questions are always like, if it's always this balance of like figuring out like, am I just special in the eyes of others because I have this cultural background? But then this cultural background is not my day-to-day life. Like, I wake up, I have my croissant, I have my coffee, I have like, I go shopping. Yeah, and then the world thinks I'm special because I'm in traditional costumes, I'm dancing, I'm praying to like, in the middle of the jungle, and how much can I perform and claim that as me just so that the West can find me interesting? Because when I'm not that interesting, if I'm not a cultural person, if I'm not in my traditional costume dancing, I'm just a person in a developing country with there's nothing else that I can hold on to besides being a very lame person. So at the end, and that project is about that. It's about this forefront of like performance, right? Like when tourists come over to Borneo, they expect some sort of like experience, and we are just trying to do that experience so that they can share their euros with us. We can go shopping. Yeah.
Maybe I'll invite a last round of reflections from Amy and Vera before I open to the floor.
Well, my reflection was another question, but it was
Oh,
just because I know you spoke a bit about, I took you onto a kind of geeky tangent. So you talked about the kind of techniques and about the structure of the sale. I just wondered if you could tell us a bit about what's on it as well, because I don't know if you've shared the kind of story behind what's on that.
Yeah, we did a small tour, so
Yeah, so I know a bit of it, but that's just
well, I mean, I was zooming into this idea of circumstances, and in my residency in BC, I was reading a lot on Ocean War, Vietnamese American who writes about what it means to be born from war, and how do you describe that? And for me as well, it's like so interesting, like how do you describe circumstances? So on the cell, it is draped, so you can't really see the details, but the details of the cell is of a scene of like Chinese babies and gods battling each other. It's like a violent scene of just clashing. And three things popped up for me with this scene, of course. It's a shipwreck. So did the shipwreck happen because the gods were just angry at me and they just hate me and they just want me to crash, so they destroyed my ship? Was the gods trying to protect me but they failed and the evil took over and the evil crashed my ship? Or was it the fact that they were just battling within themselves without me in mind?
Yeah,
And I'm
collateral
just,
damage.
it's just a collective damage that I just find myself in. And those were the questions that, ironically, I was also like negotiating with God when the show couldn't start on, on the 10th of October. It's like, why do you hate me? Why? But of course, these are all hard questions, and it was inspired by my grandfather who escaped war from the Japanese occupation and ended up in Malaysia and couldn't go back home. Didn't have the chance to go back home. And I always imagine how abandoned he must feel from like the circumstances that he's in. And I think when you can kind of like dehumanize the situation and kind of like blame it on God or like it becomes less personal, if it makes sense. Like we always,
manageable almost.
yeah,
To accept.
that there's some sort of like, of course, things that's larger than us that we cannot fully kind of like answer, but it is okay, it's answered, you know. That's why for me this show, of course, is about unwrap, but it's also about giving a name to things, right? Circumstances. And just being able to kind of give a name to something already makes it so much more lighter. That, oh yeah, you know, I ended up in Amsterdam washing dishes because circumstances. Instead of like, yeah, it's because
I'm not good
a
enough.
political person
Someone
maybe
did
do it
this,
this way.
yeah,
And
yeah.
it's harder sometimes for me for us to go down that route. And yeah, if at the end of the show, I also am thinking about this idea of peace, of like being able to just work in peace. Yeah, it makes sense.
I'll give you a remark then as well. I just wanted to thank you for sort of coming to Manchester and spending so much time thinking deeply about its history and its people and kind of giving this gift of this show to Manchester, because I think it's really, you know, it weaves in lots of different elements and it feels really special for right now. So,
Thank you so much for introducing me to the collection and being very open about it.
yeah.
I don't think that it's always the case that you have people who is managing the collection that is so willing to dive into like the more complicated and hard conversations about the collection. I think that's a very special gift also from you.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I just wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about, because what I think is quite fascinating and something maybe that when work like this travels, particularly to places like Europe, the UK, where the north is like we often think about diverse and cosmopolitan cities in very well-established urban centres, but you know, Borneo, and I think there are a lot of references in the work that you've made that kind of represent sort of intra-regional diversity. And when you were talking about, you know, and being in search of peace in some respects, how yeah, even the island you're from is like quite contested in terms of being made up of very different kind of nation states, let alone different ethnic groups. So just a bit about what it means, I think, to bring some of these cultural references together is actually, you know, quite significant, particularly from a position of like distance where you can, in a way that might, you know, be more loaded when it's like more confrontational in the place that they're emerge from. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think, well, there is this thing where when I was doing my work, a lot this word hospitality pops up. And I used to be really ashamed of that because like the Western world be like, oh, you too, as if you're like from hospitable land. I realized later on that it's a very sophisticated craft to be able to be hospitable, right? To be able to kind of like host, but also not rob someone else of his dignity. It's something very interesting for me to explore. The only thing you can do as a person from that land later on in realize is just to expand from what you already are and expand from what you know instead of converting yourself to fit into what it is here. So like when I was in school, there's two questions, right? Did I come here to be more Dutch, or did you invite me here because you wanted more perception of the world and more diversity of the thinking? And for me to add on to the diversity of this classroom, for example, the more fruitful way is for me to know myself more, to add on to the diversity. Like what does it mean to add on to diversity if you're gonna convert me into a Dutch person? Then it's not exactly diversity, right? And that's where it kind of shifted, of like how we speak, coming from where we are, and developing from there. So I think it's nice to hear that it is translating kind of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's always a situation as well where in a region where you are, for example, somewhere like Southeast Asia, those demarcations are so much more emphasized, but when you're in the diaspora together, it's like those barriers kind of dissolve and there's a shared understanding and language, you know.
And I think there was a beautiful comment about diversity that you made, right? This where the line between like diversity and assimilation. And I think that's also resonant to a lot of the discussions that we're having in the UK right now. And maybe with that, I'll open to the floor and I will pass you the microphone because this is recorded.
Hello, thank you. Sorry, this might be slightly free association because I'm a little tired. Sarah James, Manchester School of Art. I'm delighted to have played a role in co-commissioning of this fantastic work. So it's so rich to me, and as I was seeing the images of this incredible body of work, I was looking at this, just wanted to hear a bit about, there is an optimism and a radicalism that they kept on saying, that you have nothing to lose, you know, but to throw off your chains, which takes us back to slavery, it takes us back to Manchester, it takes us back to empire, colonization, and the deep kind of heart, dark heart of kind of racial capitalism. And there's something so clever about the intergenerational nature of that slavery, so these false deities, you know, of the influencer and the billionaire speckled with their cosmic kind of metallic. And I was just thinking, you know, there's also something interesting about you working in textiles, but also graphics, because they're so beautifully graphic. There's a broad line. There's this tension between what it means to throw up the chains now, right? So to throw up the chains as a shop labourer under post-internet, you know, neoliberal digital capitalism, versus when you're talking about your grandfather or your father. And I suppose I was just interested in hearing where the optimism, there is an optimism, I think, and maybe for me that's maybe finding in the wreckage, in the burnt cinders of this sort of genocidal or ecocidal kind of extractive capitalism, something beautiful, perhaps. So I guess that was more kind of a reflection, but there's something so poetic about the intergenerational and the different forms of slavery through migration and race that maybe, yeah, I don't know, maybe how do we reject the slavery that we are all suffering in different ways, I guess?
It's always complicated for me to answer big questions like that. I'm just an artist. But I take a lot of inspiration. So I started this talk talking to Jo-Lene about how I came to Manchester looking for answers of who I am as well, from the past, right? From people who are also working in factories. And what they have taught me, what the People's History Museum has taught me, is also this ability for us as humans to find hope and glory in like depths of despair. So if you think about the People History Museums like labor union certificates, when you look at it, it's so decorated and it's so glorious, and there's always all this like mention of values. But people forget that this came out of like very dangerous, dirty situations, right? Of people dying, of people not being able to protect their wives and children. And I'm trying to adopt that. You know, I think that in the art world, it is a special place where we're allowed to grieve. And I feel like being able to grieve and the optimism that comes after you grieve feels a bit more grounding for me, if it makes sense. It's not a lot of careers that you can actually just be sad. In the advertising world, there's no space for you to be sad. Everything needs to be optimistic. You're trying to sell cars, you're trying to sell chocolate bars, and it's always about statistics, it's always about results. I'm trying to see how we can have more stories and conversations about being sad and after being sad, finding optimism. Makes sense.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you.
I see a hand. Sorry.
Thank you. I really like the scene. And I wonder whether we should, introduce more ornate patterns in our clothing. Back in the 60s, we did, it was in fashion, flower power, and all that. But I look round, and I'm as guilty as anyone. We have this drab colours all over us. Would it not be a good thing to introduce some of your textile ideas into our clothing? Just basic everyday patterns, for example?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. That goes back to when I was even studying. So there was this one day, one semester where I did my work, and my head of department came to me and was like, Marcos, I think your work is too traditional. It's too complicated. You should reference the fashion houses, look at how slick their stuff is. And I have what does it mean to be too traditional in the amount of work that I had to read? It was 3 months of doing this, and it's so conveniently kind of parked at this idea of you're too traditional, it's traditional. Even when you're looking at anthropological museums as well, when we're looking at Southeast Asia, Indonesian gold jewelry collection, for example, and you look at how intricate and how much control of the idea of aesthetic is from these masters of craft. Years and years of work, years and years of development to achieve this. How in the contemporary world it's just it's so traditional. It kind of is a bit of an ick for me that I'm trying to also, trying to fight against it. But that was why in my previous work in Circus, it's so decorated, it's so layered, it's also this kind of anti-advertisement where we believe that nowadays for us to kind of absorb information is just one product, an iPhone, and a tagline, just buy it. Where as humans we could have handled way more sophistication in how we see it today, right? Nowadays if it's so ornament, it's oh my god, it hurts my eyes. But back then people could comprehend this level of complexity. And perhaps we have kind of lost it. So I think that's a very interesting remark from you as well.
I like how you reversed the value, from something negative to a positive. And then I'm going to segue to the advertising and that kind of optimism by saying, while you can't quite have Marcus in the fashion that you wear yet, you can go home with a tote bag. This is original design patterned by Marcos, which is currently being woven by the embroidery machine, the sculpture that you see. So if we haven't quite that many left because they're very popular. So maybe Julie, you can look the other back, and Julie you could model, you could show us the two that you have as well.
I'm not employed here.
Up in the front. So you know what? You can order them. If you let me know what pattern you would like by looking at what's been produced by the embroidery machine, you could produce them bespoke. £25 only. Now, next intellectual question.
I couldn't decide between the two designs, so
Oh, yes. I'm going to pass the mic to the row behind. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much. The work is really beautiful. I'm really curious to know how your kind of relationship with the Netherlands as your home and your base may have informed some of your work as well. Because I think we've heard you talk about obviously the influence of Borneo, and then also the kind of the theme of migration, and then also Manchester's textile history being a big part of it because it's co-commissioned here. So I'm really curious because I am also a diaspora artist, and for me I find it really difficult sometimes to figure out where the message is between my gratitude for the past and being able to kind of have a career here and a life here, but also how that was a direct result of, well, maybe not direct result, but kind of created by colonial structures and capitalist structures, as you were talking about, and then benefiting from that as an artist that is now based in the UK. So I'm really curious to know like what the influence of the Netherlands in your work, and also like your kind of relationship and your feelings with it in your work as well.
Well, I mean, the only story I can think about with this question is probably like this small story of like one day we always have this kind of like conversation of like how the Asian production destroyed the factories in the Netherlands, right? The Brabant region, even the UK here as well, was just up in like Blackburn. It used to be full of factories and it got destroyed by like the takeover of Asian production and stuff like that. And one day I was like in the Netherlands, I was visiting this one weird small museum, and then on the wall of the museum there's a factory, but then the sky is blue and like the canal is clean, and then saying like, yeah, we moved out all our factories out because the factories was too polluting. And that little story shifted the whole idea of what it means to also be in this place, you know, like it's about the stories that we tell ourselves, and also how we transmit the stories. I was in Casa Binale, and the person told me like, yeah, the whole factory kind of like went extinct because production was left and people lost their jobs. But then I was also asking the person like, did they lost their jobs or did they change to a better job, because do they really actually want to go back to working in a factory? So those are like really interesting kind of like dialogues that you can only have when you're like in the country itself, because from afar you always assume that they're just haters because we took away their jobs or like we destroyed their factory. But when you're here, it really depends on how you kind of craft the story, and sometimes these stories are very hidden in like the factory work itself. And once you kind of like, it is also because perhaps that I come from Borneo that this type of stories pop up for me more, right? If I was a Dutch person, I would assume like when I see this place, like, oh, okay, yeah. But for me, it's like always like this brain crack where it's like, oh my god. Yeah, like this because they moved all the pollution to my country. Like, what does that mean? Like, oh my god, I'm dying. And it's this always this constant kind of battle with like reality and stories here, and how do I carefully kind of like tread around how I feel and what I'm trying to tell the West of how I feel about certain things that kind of shook my world. I think those are the things that well, my whole career is working on. It's like this. It's like questions about how you see me as like a person from Borneo, questions about how I'm here working in the textile industry, thinking that I'm working in like one of the most advanced working industry in the world, but then actually it's actually okay. Like I used to think that I'm like trying to like revive or like try to like help with like figuring out how to solve the textile crisis in this country, but then if you're not honest of why we became like this and how we're going to solve it, right? Yeah, if it makes sense. Yeah.
I reckon we have time for 2 more questions on the floor. Reflections, anyone?
Thank you. I'm learning a lot here. Having very little knowledge of textiles, I'm just looking at this almost like a piece of music. I'm really interested in what you were saying about the machines, and you're using them almost like an orchestra, with you being the conductor and creating this piece. Do you ever, I'm just wondering if you ever either make a mistake in the programming, or the machine has a bit of fun with you and something happens, like it's a happy mistake. Do you ever wind up with a piece that you weren't quite intending, it changes your idea of what it was going to be in the first place?
Well, I don't know if we ever have the chance to see how I work. On the computer you only see lines, because that's how the computer read the files. So as a textile programmer, you can only imagine what is going to happen. So a lot of mistakes happen. And you can only check the mistakes when it's woven, and you cannot go back. It's not like you can delete or like it's not like painting where you can paint it over. It's like once it's woven, and you can't go back, and you have to like start over again. And you're right in the sense that actually a lot of textile development happens either at the back of the textiles, or like when a mistake happens and say, oh, what color is this? It's so interesting, and you have to trace back and look into the files like, how do I make this? A lot of the developments actually happen like that. So it's really interesting that you picked it up. And from that like mistake, we try to kind of develop, like intentionally make it happen behind the whole piece. So it's like a very technical and geeky kind of world that it's very hard to explain to people when they're not in the kind of production career itself. And when we kind of develop something, if let's say you're like an artist who is not in the field, you're just choosing from a catalog of what you want, and then we're just making it for you, right? Because you don't have the how do you put this? Not the chance, but like it's very expensive to weave.
Yes.
And it's a lot of hours. And because I'm working on the machine, so I have access to hours. But yeah, in this contemporary time, it's all about speed. It's about how fast you can produce things. It's probably one, 100%.
Yeah.
So it's a small privilege to be able to be like a textile developer. That you kind of form a relationship with like the craft, how it develops over time. It's almost like any other craft. I see it as a craft. A lot of people might not see it as a craft, but I see it as a craft.
And I'll just quickly interject as a quick nod to the labor behind this huge sale, as well as this embroidered piece. So like, you have to go close and you see, like there's lots of embroidery going on. You had help from your friends.
Yes, thank you Hakan, thank you Vincent.
Yeah.
Yeah, we worked until the very last hour. It's quite intense with this
Yeah.
work. Yeah.
And I think I'll also thank our installation fabricator and engineer who constructed this mask for us.
Yeah.
Archiform, if you ever need anyone, hit them up. Final question for the evening. All right, we shall take two.
Yeah, we'll take the last question.
Hi, I'm Burgess. I'm a philosopher from Manchester Met. I just want to pick up on that last conversation about the ontology, where the ontology of textile is interwoven in the process of making. So there's a very interesting question there, just picking up on composition, also what, in relation to what the piece is. What is the piece in relation to the act of producing? I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that from your own practice.
That's a very philosophical question.
Sarah, I would help us out.
Yeah, you have to break it down.
Translate it. You can be like a programmer. Break it down for us.
Maybe
please.
this is a performance question. Yeah. But yes, in terms of your craft and the act of making in relation to the piece that we here see exhibited in the space. Do you have the ideas of where one ends and one the next thing?
I can try to answer that question.
Yeah.
So like what you're asking is like, do I have a relationship with the development and how it turns out into the textiles? Is that what you're trying to do? Yeah, I think so. I mean, making textiles, you are also controlling, well, the basic foundation of textile making is tension. We are not using any glue, we are not using anything that's binding it, and it's all bounded by like physical force, the physics, the magic of physics. So it is about like how well you control tension. And it's really weird because like when I was in school, I had to manage a lot of tensions.
Yeah.
And like that's how you kind of learn how to live life as well. Like how much tension can you manage? I'm managing 11,520 tensions.
Yeah.
And that's how you kind of like create the work. If you're looking at this piece, for example, it is, for me, like as a person who knows textile, this is too tight. It has to form like its own like shape and stuff like that. But when you're looking at the cell, for example, you want it to drape. That means like tension needs to be open. And these are all like things that you kind of like have a relationship with later on with a lot of like trial and errors of how you can actually create it, because not all fabrics will create the same.
Yeah.
And you know this from like and clothes. Like you need like tough fabric to like have structure, but you need like soft fabric to create that. A tough fabric is just a fabric with a lot of tension, and a soft fabric is a fabric with a loose tension. And there's a lot of like weird parallels to like life lessons in like how you weave as well. So maybe that's like some sort of like answer.
What's really interesting with your answer is that it's a similar answer. So I have a PhD student who works in compositions, music composition, who works with a similar challenge of the intentionality and the authorship, but where that only shows up in the face of mistake in the process of making. So that's a very interesting answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think you can just pass the mic down. The last question is the gentleman in the room.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I wanted to ask because I'm just back actually from a residency in Sarawak in Borneo.
House ACH?
Yes.
Ah, okay.
Rusty.
Yeah, Rusty. And I was quite surprised when I was there, realizing that with an older generation, so what we would call like baby boomers here, there's a real lack of, they're quite nostalgic about like the British rule and that kind of time, and like a lack of criticality around the extraction and things. And I was wondering if you had any kind of reflections on that, having, you know, obviously spent a lot of time in Europe now and now in Manchester, and then like, sort of follow on to that was kind of if there was anything about your time in Manchester you kind of discovered that was also was a surprise to you, that was like indifferent to like maybe preconceptions that you had before coming over?
Yeah, I think I started my journey here in Europe when I was 23. I'm 30 years old right now, so 7 years ago. I learned about the word decolonization at 24. So that was when everything kind of like came. A lot of like the work that I'm doing for my previous project is about that. It's about conversation about decolonization and how do we talk about decolonization without the white person in the picture, right? What you're trying to ask is like, you see a lot of like the shadows of my colonizer in my country, and it never leaves. And what I'm trying to do is like, what if the colonizer is not there? How do we talk about our stories? Because what we know about ourselves as Sarawakians and people from Borneo is from the descriptions of our colonizer that they left for us when they gave us independence. And since then, we never had the chance to write our own descriptions of what it means. And these descriptions you can find in anthropological museums on how they describe our craft, how they describe our humans, and they just never left.
Yeah.
Because we never had the time to figure out what's next from that. So even if you go to museums, it's the same way that they describe us.
Yeah.
We have to describe ourselves. It's the only reference that we can describe us. And that's a lot of work to do. Like, what does it mean to be independent? It's that question as well. When I'm here as well, it is doing that job. Besides, of course, constantly talking about my identity, it's also like finding my own footing on what my opinions are with the industry, what my opinions are in Europe. How do I talk about it as a practice, and how do I interact with humans and make them understand what I'm trying to explain? And that for me is the practice of decolonization, of like, figuring out a new description for myself. Yeah.
As a Malaysian, I feel the need to also respond to your question, even though it wasn't directed to me, is that this nostalgia for the good old days of empire, of being a British colony, is not unique to Borneo or Sarawak, right? Borneo, Malaysia. It also happens in very developed parts of peninsular Malaysia. Just go to Penang, and they still sell you high tea, and the people at the hotel, they still wear that colonial ranger uniforms to greet you. And now that I'm here, I see it as lack of criticality, right? But actually, it's not that simple. It's not that the people back home are not as astute. But this is the legacy, the strength that is left behind. I mean, how strong it was, the propaganda of a benevolent colonizer, the benevolent empire. We come here to help you savages develop. We will build you schools, we will build you churches, we will build you hospitals, which they did. But there were a lot of other things going on and a lot of exploitation. I would say like the tin industry from Malaysia played a big role in a lot of public funds structure that could take place in the UK, for example.
Rubber as well.
Yeah, rubber as well. And I mean, then there's the textile industry in South Asia, but to not go into that detail. So yeah, I think it's like how you said, like it's from coming, like when you were here in the Netherlands, well not here in the Netherlands, but in the Netherlands that you learned of the word decolonization. It's also true for me, right? Like it wasn't till I moved to the Netherlands and then I was in the decolonial discourse. But in practice, it's actually happening back home. It may not be articulated in these terms, but it is happening. And of course, the previous generation, they had their struggles to fight. Coming out of independence was no easy job. Survival was kind of like top rank. And then so it's now on our generation and the next to kind of do this work with some critical distance. Yeah, thank you.
I think I also want to say like two last things. I think now that I'm listening to this, Kenyalan Circus was me trying to sell myself to the West on my terms. This whole project with like industrial weaving is also my attempt of like, yeah, why am I not allowed to do modern weaving? Why am I only allowed to do craft to feel special? Like maybe it is also that kind of defiance of doing my own things at my own term that I never had the chance to do. That nowadays I'm glad that people are noticing, but it was in my background that's like, I want to sell myself in my own terms. If I want to sell myself, I sell myself, but it's my term, right?
Yeah.
So those are like the small steps we're taking, I guess.
Any concluding? No. All right. Well,
Yeah.
thank you very much.